Spring is in full bloom here in New York City, and I can't help but notice when I walk through the park, the earth colors, the beautiful color of earth, becoming more prominent because it's contrasted against all the vivid greens and pinks of springtime. And in some of the more recent paintings, this one I'm just finishing up, I'm bringing some of those browns, those earth colors, out of the background into the fore. And I think it gives the painting a sense of being turned inside out, and gives it a kind of fecund, kind of fertile, anything possible sense. And a lot of those colors, for instance, in this palette, I'm using, instead of white, I'm using a Portland gray medium. It's a Gamblin color. I like to use other colors in lieu of white to bring my values up. And in this case, I'm mixing just raw umber into the Portland gray medium. Get that nice and clean. Then I'm going to drag in some quinacridone red, which is going to bend the color into a slightly cooler direction. And you can see it creates a nice kind of taupey, pale pink, a color which I associate with some of the French naturalist painters like Dagnan Bouveray. Then I'll drag in a little Hansa yellow light and heat that up a bit, and it creates three distinct moods, but all related with that host color of the original umber and gray. I'm very interested in the notion of a painting as a fixed object, a static vantage point. Something completely obvious, but something I think about nonetheless. And if you think of any painting, especially any landscape painting, what you have is a fixed view of a place. So there's automatically a reference to someone standing there looking at that place. And through the very careful and artificial construction of the image of the landscape, it represents the confluence of two identities, the artist and the viewer. And a lot of times when you hear people talk or describe a painting or talk about a painting, they talk about time being frozen or time being arrested, slowed down. I tend to think the opposite. When I have a meaningful experience with a painting, I feel like experience has been accelerated, that time has been sped up and compressed and concentrated down to the clarity of a diamond, and then shot right into my nervous system. I feel like everything has been sped up. And I played drums for over 20 years, all through high school and in college. And at the College of Charleston, where I went 25 years ago, I had on one side of the building a private painting studio, and on the other side I have a private studio for my drum set. And I had a master key to the entire building, all the offices, which nobody knew about until now. And when I had a problem with a painting, I would haul it from the painting side over to my drum side, set it up in front of my drum kit, and I would practice for 30 or 40 minutes. And there was something about that repetition and that syncopated rhythm, each one of my limbs doing something different at a different rhythm, objectively staring at something, the painting subjectively across the room, that helped close the gap between movement, the way that I move through life, and the inanimate fixed notion of a painting. And essentially all I devote my life to is closing gaps, and that was one of them. I think that's how one advances as an artist. You close various gaps. And I certainly look at great painters like Thomas Eakins, for example, or Winslow Homer. Snap the Whip comes to mind, or the paintings of George Caleb Bingham, some of the rafting paintings, the card players. All of which involve movement and dynamism and the ephemeral, but all rinsed in a clear white light and arranged architecturally in a proscenium, in which I think the conceptual rigor of those paintings is derived from the authority of stillness, the authority, the mastery of the fixed view. And there are a couple of devices throughout history which have helped artists with that notion of the fixed view. One of them, of course, being mathematical perspective, and the other photography. And I do not tend to use linear perspective very much in my paintings. I tend to use either atmospheric perspective or color space, or both together. So I feel like a lot of my my ideas and my exposure to the notion of a fixed view comes from photography, from growing up with photography. And as a kid, I would make these view boxes, which was essentially kind of a tapered shoebox, and we had a view piece here, and it would widen out to a big rectangle. Within that was a smaller rectangle that was completely open, and that was like a movie screen. And even inside of the box, I would have little tiny movie seats and a little aisle and little people sitting in there looking at a big screen, which was real life. And as my friends played soccer, I would walk around with my little view box. And I remember one time a bumblebee flew into my little movie theater and stung me right in the eye, which I took as an omen for good things later. So that, I think, contributed very much to the notion of looking at life, looking at the landscape through the artifice of that proscenium. That helped me try to create these fixed viewpoints in my own work now. And how does one do that? How do you create, how do you suggest or evoke time and the ephemeral and movement and vitality all in the skins of something that's inanimate? It's so mysterious to me, and it's so elusive and so magical. What painting can do, better than anything in the world. It's skins of colored dirt applied with economy and deliberateness and authority. How do you create light where there couldn't possibly be light? How do you suggest space where there cannot be any space? How do you evoke an emotional reach in something that is literally just luminous grit? All I do in my studio all day is move stuff around on canvases, but I think the construction of the painting, when it's finally finished, comes in the deliberate placement of things in stillness, in that fixed viewpoint, in which hopefully the fugitive can give way to the concrete. If you've seen any of these videos, you've probably heard me talk about my interest in the notion of a painting as the interface between the internal world and the external world, between the walls of the room and the physical presence of the viewer. And it speaks to the way a painting comes into being through a series of physical manipulations, tactile events, the stacking of colors, to suggest a physical experience, to affirm the body and the placement of the viewer in the interior room, in the fixed position, but also hopefully thrust them into an experience that's more internal, more emotional, more cognitive, what Kafka called using an axe on the frozen sea within us. And that a painting, when it's working, is a fully dimensional, economical summation of those two positions, internal and external, all fused into one experience, one object. And I know the notion of internal and external sounds obvious, but you and I know as painters, nothing is obvious. Everything must be taken apart and examined and re-examined. We devote our lives to the obvious. And that's what I love so much about stage magic. That which seems unimportant to the audience is actually critical to the magician. And that which might seem important to the audience is actually unimportant and might be a ruse for misdirection. Thinking and studying magic has greatly enhanced my thinking in painting. And I love Vermeer. And one of the things I've always loved about Vermeer is they are a celebration of the internal, of interior intimacy, but also with a hint of the outside world. Whether it be light coming through a gauzy window, or a map charting the outside world hanging on the wall, or a letter, some device suggesting the outside world. And I think in my paintings, it's somewhat the reverse. I call myself a landscape painter, and my paintings certainly bear all the fingerprints of the landscape with horizon lines and tree-like dividers, but always with a hint of the inside, always a hint of the room. And some of the ways I achieve that are by using very dramatic scale shifts from very aggressive and frontal to very distant, suggesting outside, inside, with nothing in between. With these bands that run, they traverse the top to bottom, suggesting both trees and figures, but also which formally divide and subdivide the space into smaller compartments or rooms. And also I apply paint with tools that sometimes give me a very flat troweled surface. Big fat wide brushes, knives, cake icing implements, and a lot of the times my favorite tool for that are these placards which we produce, these promotional things for my work which are sent out when people ask for them with my name on it and images. I always make sure we order 500 or so extra. They're very inexpensive to make, and I tear them in half and I use this edge to trowel on the paint very flatly. And when the paint is very flat, it reaffirms the artificiality of the picture plane. It brings the flatness of the picture plane back to the front and reminds the viewer of the fact that this is a big, fat, hairy lie, the painting. And I also love the notion of destruction and of disrespect. I've talked about this before. I disrespect my materials, but I respect what they can do. Whenever I get new brushes, the first thing I do is snap them in half. And I love tearing things with my paintings on them in half, or my name, ripping them in half. I don't take myself seriously. I take my paintings very seriously. And I was out the other night talking with some painter friends about the notion of destruction and rebellion and the radical as it plays out in our lives as artists. And a lot of the public perceptions of artists is as radical, nonconformist, as rebellious. And I've never really felt that. We talked about the notion of that information is disseminated so quickly and so broadly, and we have access to so much that hardly anything these days actually shocks anymore. We've seen so much. It almost seems more radical now to say that you believe in the tenderness and goodness of people, and in loyalty, and in some of those things which may have seemed very traditional and very heartfelt. I've never felt the need to rebel. I feel like it's important as a painter to be yourself, and then to own that, and then just make your work. Just riff on that. Take your work from that. And that notion, some artists may tear up hotel rooms and turn over a table at a cocktail party. I earn a very good living smearing colored dirt on canvas. To me, that's radical enough. Tearing a placard in half with my name on it is as rebellious as I want to get. I may, when I buy a chapstick, I may smush it or something. That's as radical as I want to get. Everything has to be in the work, and I've worked very hard over the last 35 years to try to know myself and trust myself, to be my own best friend, and then use that as the platform for my work, to own it. And I think, back to the Vermeer metaphor, the notion of outside with a hint of the inside, I think, is more akin to a painter like Stanley Spencer, the British painter, who I've wanted to talk about for months. And I remember in college, my old mentor, my dear friend Michael Tyzak, a British painter, I would say, Michael, can you tell me about Stanley Spencer? And he would say, Brian, I knew Stanley. And we would go into his studio and share a couple of bourbons, and he would tell me about Stanley Spencer intimately. And Spencer's landscapes, especially the Cookham landscapes, rolling, lush English landscapes, but always with a hint of the inside, always with a loneliness, a vantage point seeming as it's from a kitchen window or a greenhouse, some lonely interior space looking to the outside. So I think that's more apropos of my thinking in my own work. But again, as painters, how do you do that? How do we suggest one thing with a hint of something else? I'm very interested in the notion of that fixed view as embodying both an internal and external experience at the same time. One thing hinting at another thing.